So the final speaker of this session will be Fredrik Lindeberg, who is the security expert at NetNod. He joined in October 2021 as part of the security engineering team, and his role is focused on internal processes, public policy development, and the implications of policy on NetNod services. So please join me in welcoming Fredrik to the stage.
Thank you. So as Rob said, my name is Fredrik Lindeberg. I work here at NetNod with internal security and a lot of policy. So if you've seen a public statement written by NetNod, I was probably the one who penned it, especially in public consultation rounds. Today's presentation is going to concern NIS2, this amazing framework everybody's talking about today. My intention is not to talk about the different articles in detail, but rather to talk about how NIS2 fits into the greater regulatory landscape right now. So, to start off, I will discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly with NIS2 in some manner of detail. Because there are good parts with NIS2, there are also bad parts with NIS2. And there are also a couple of things which you need to know, to be aware of, to be able to go forward properly. So, NIS2, what is it? Assuming you've never heard of NIS2 before, I will go through NIS2 very quickly. So NIS2 is a piece of legislation written by the European Parliament, so the EU, common level. It covers 15 sectors, everything from infrastructure to public administration to research. And it concerns information security or cybersecurity. It classifies all those entities into two larger classes. You have the essential entities and you have the important entities. These are called väsentliga och viktiga in Swedish. So the essential entities include basically all infrastructure. So it's infrastructure including digital infrastructure, it's finance sector, it's the public administration, etc. So several of NetNod services are covered here. So DNS and the IX services are covered. The main difference between the important and the essential entities in the classification is what the government is allowed to do in terms of oversight and the size of the fees. So for essential entities, the government can come in and say, we want to do some oversight, we want to look at everything, and they're allowed to do that. They are not allowed to do that for the important entities. They can only do oversight after an incident. This is the main differentiator between them. And the penalties are a bit lower for non-compliance for important entities than essential entities, but those are the most important differences. The important entities mostly conserve different services, goods, and research in society, while the essential ones focus on harder and larger things like infrastructure and finance and public administration. That's NIS2 very quickly. And then NIS2 says that you need to do several things to attain a high level of cybersecurity. We'll get to that later. So, NIS and Sweden and NetNod, to put things into perspective, NIS1, as it exists right now, it covers a subset of NetNod's DNS services. It doesn't cover the root service, for example, but many of the DNS services. NIS2 will cover a subset of both IX services and DNS services. That is, in the case of Sweden, NIS2 expands into electronic communications networks in a new way. And as I said before, NetNod is an essential entity, the higher level in this classification schema. Also important to note here is that NIS2 covers entire legal entities. So even if just a tiny part of your organization is covered by the regulation itself, the entire organization is covered by the legislation. So if you are a very large corporation and you're doing some electronic communications networks, your entire organization is covered anyhow. The Swedish draft law, in the Swedish context, it was released last week, the 5th of March, Tuesday last week, I think. And currently here in Sweden, there is a public consultation ongoing until the 28th of May. So it's running for basically 3 months. NetNod will respond to this common public consultation, of course. And important to note in this context, I wanted to bring it up especially here because it surprised me when I saw it, actually, that electronic communication networks and publicly available electronic communication services they are covered in Sweden even if they are not established in Sweden. And this is quite interesting. So in the directive level, at the EU level, it basically, that directive says that you are covered where you're established, basically. But the Swedish draft law says that you are covered in Sweden even if you are not established in Sweden, if you have customers in Sweden. This is quite important to know. So what they're doing here in the draft law is that they're saying that this only concerns oversight, right? They won't primarily fine you here, but you will be under oversight here, even if you're not established in Sweden. So, NetNod and NIS2, what have we done so far? You might have heard that the EU, or basically the EU Commission, they considered to put the root name service system under the auspices of NIS2. We thought this was a very bad idea, right? You know that the American defense system, there are 3 or 4 agencies of the American defense system which runs root servers, right? And the EU wanted to put those under oversight of the EU. You can guess that would have been quite messy. So we worked together with RIPE NCC to ensure that the root name service system, and especially the root name server operators, were not part of NIS2, and we were successful there. So the root DNS server system is not part of NIS2. And we have also tried to note the potential pitfalls of the current and suggested regulation. And there are 2 main concerns we have. One concerns ex-ante provisions. I will go through in more detail what an ex-ante provision is. And also the issue of aggregate of wholesale services in supply chains. The second issue here can briefly be described as, let's say you have 2 services. You have 2 NIS services. You have the NIS Service 1 and you have the NIS Service 2. Those in turn depend on components for function. So let's say Service 1 depends on Component 1 and Component 2, and you have Service 2 depending on Component 2 and Component 3. Then, obviously, Component 2 is more important than Service 1 and Service 2, right? Because if Component 2 goes down, both Service 1 and Service 2 will go down. And this is potentially quite bad. NIS2 does not really handle this, and this is one of the things we're quite vocal about, that the legislation should be able to cover this scenario where multiple NIS-level services or other important services are, through some kind of structure, codependent on single components, where a single component failing will bring down a system. So, what is this? The directive, the NIS2 directive, at an EU level is a directive. The name of the directive is the directive, and then there are a couple of numbers, identifiers, on measures for a high common level of cybersecurity across the Union. That is the formal name of the directive at an EU level. And for us who work with these kinds of things, a lot of these terms are obvious, but I thought I would go through some of them to point out what they're trying to do here. So it's a directive. That is, a directive means that member states will implement it. The EU Parliament, they have 2 primary types of legal documents, or 2 primary types of regulation. They have directives implemented in member states, and they also have regulation, which are implemented at an EU level. For example, GDPR is a piece of regulation, not a directive, whilst directives like NIS2 are implemented in member states rather than implemented at an EU-wide level. NIS2 also concerns measures. That means things which should be done somehow. It also contains the keyword common. These measures should be common, right? All organizations should do the same set of measures, or at least a similar set of measures. So there is some kind of commonality here. And it also concerns cybersecurity here. And note here that cybersecurity are the activities necessary to protect network and information systems. It's the activities necessary to protect the users of such systems. And it's the activities to protect other persons affected by cyber threats. So that is the definition of cybersecurity in this context. This is what the NIS2 directive is supposed to do. So kind of high-level activities, which kind of should be the same across the union, and they should do the same kind of measures. So there should be some commonality here. Now, the directive itself is based on, you could say, three different bags of stuff. You have the directive itself, which is voted on by the EU Parliament. You have the guidelines, which are approved by the EU Commission and the NISA, and these are done continuously. Currently, there are 2 guidelines published, and they further develop on some of the provisions. I think it's Article 4 and 6, unless I don't remember correctly. And then there will also be laws, which are approved by mostly the parliaments of nation states. So for example, if you look at the agenda for Sweden, the draft law was published last week. End of the public consultation period is in May. And then in the fall, they will vote on it. And the idea is that the Swedish law will come into force in the beginning of 2025. So a bit late, according to that. So that is the very, 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 very quick overview of NIS2. Now I will go into the good parts of this. So, some perspectives in which NIS2 makes perfect sense, where this is the perfect piece of legislation or regulation to go forward. So I would like to introduce the idea of a perfect bureaucrat, right? The way a bureaucrat at an EU level or nation state level is likely to think of it. So there is this old idea that you need order to build society, right? So this proverb comes from Njal's saga, and it says that society should build on law, and without it, it perishes. And this sentence is commonly found in many texts, or it's similar sentences, rather. And I think the second part of it is very important. Not only should society build on law or order, but also that without law and order, society itself would perish. So there is this inherent fear here that if we don't manage to have order, society will fail. So in this perspective, what you're thinking about is the possibility of sanctions, you're thinking about order, you're thinking about rule of law and jurisdiction. And what you're trying to accomplish somehow is the prevention of degenerate behavior through law and order, right? You set up a rule system, which everybody is supposed to follow, and if you don't follow it, you get fined or you go to jail, right? That's how laws work. You're not allowed to break the law, right? If you are a bureaucrat, you probably think in terms of these tools as the tools you have in your toolbox if you want to attain this goal, right? This goal, which usually is some form of order. You either go the regulatory direction, that is, you try to write laws, you try to decide what entities and persons are allowed to do. Or you go the financing route, that is, you give money. So regulation has, you have a spectrum of laws you can write. You can either write what is known as ex-ante legislation, or you can write what is known as ex post regulation. I will go into a bit more depth on that on the next slide. And if you're talking about financing, you can either talk about procurement of services, that is, the public is acting as a market actor, buying services on the market just like any other actor. Or you could talk about the state or the public as a direct financier of function or infrastructure or services. For example, research funding. So, this is the spectrum of regulation. NIS2 is regulation, right? It's not financing. It's not the EU trying to affect the market. It's the EU writing laws which are supposed to control and govern your behavior, right? So when you talk about regulation, you have what is known as ex-ante regulation or ex-ante laws. These are also known as sectoral laws, laws which define certain good behavior, certain non-degenerate behavior within a sector. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have laws which rather govern accountability, ex post laws, which are more generally applicable laws, which, yeah, liability lies here, for example. You are liable for what you do, while ex ante laws decide that you need to do thing 1, thing 2, and thing 3 in some specific order to be able to live up to the regulatory framework. And there is some area in the middle which could say something like you must follow best practice. NIS 2, for the most part, lies over here, right? NIS 2 says what you should do in quite high detail in terms of information security within your organization. NIS 2 does not primarily concern accountability or liability in case something goes wrong. It mostly controls what you shouldn't or should not do. So in the larger scales of things, this graph here, I'm trying to illustrate what NIS focuses on, right? So NIS 2 describes the process measures you're held accountable to. Mostly NIS 2 concerns cybersecurity, risk management measures, and reporting obligations for entities, right? So risk management measures, that's risk management, right? You go through different threats, and you handle them, or you decide not to handle them. There are reporting obligations. That is, if you have an incident, you need to report it. If you don't report it, you break the law. And there are rules and obligations on information sharing as well. These are all, or most of these are high-level measures. They're related to structure and order from a cybersecurity perspective. So if we think about this figure as down here we have operational matters, and up there we have process-related matters. NIS covers process-related matters, right? It's an ex-ante provision regarding process matters in cybersecurity, right? NIS 2 has basically nothing at all to do with operational matters. Now I continue on to the bad, because there are some things which I would argue are potential pitfalls here. And that is that NIS 2 does not primarily concern operational cybersecurity capabilities, right? The focus of NIS 2 is not operational capability. It's doing cybersecurity at a high level the same way. Using risk management frameworks, having reporting functions for incidents and information sharing. It doesn't concern being operationally good in terms of cybersecurity. It doesn't handle liability and damages for failing, right? So basically, as a NIS 2 actor, you're liable or accountable for following high-level process requirements. You're not liable for failing. If you have an incident, you're not automatically liable, unless you have a contract, of course, saying otherwise. But NIS 2 does not hold you accountable for damages caused by failing. And this is a very important distinction to understand. That NIS 2 targets high-level processes in an organization, not the operational capacity of the organization. There are different directives. They're not the focus of this talk, but I will mention them. It's the Cyber Resilience Act and the Product Liability Directive. They put more focus on liability. The Product Liability Act, of course, is really focusing on liability. And the current Product Liability Directive says that there is something called strict liability for physical products. The draft law for the new product liability, or well, it's not a formal draft, says that there could be strict liability for software products as well. That means a vendor would be strictly liable for damages caused by their product, even if it's a software product. Think, for example, if you're a platform provider. So I'd say that the Product Liability Act is more likely to have a greater effect on us actors than NIS 2. Another issue with NIS 2 is that organizations don't have unlimited resources, right? If you're a for-profit company, somebody comes to you and say, you need to do these things in addition to what you're already doing. They probably have to either reallocate resources or they have to increase their prices. In a very competitive market, organizations are probably more likely to divert resources, right? So it is very possible that resources are diverted from operational security to high-level process-based security. And you should all be aware of this. Very important, I will repeat this throughout the presentation, that structure and order is not the same as operational capabilities. We also have the ugly part of NIS2. That is this process focus, right? There is a difference between order of processes and good operational cybersecurity capabilities. I mentioned this before. As long as you are aware of it, it's not an issue. But it's very, very, very important to understand that it's possible to be NIS2 compliant, but still have a very low level of operational cybersecurity. And it's also possible not to be NIS2 compliant while having a very high level of operational cybersecurity. These are not the same thing, right? And as an organization, you probably need to focus on one of these, right? I just want to be very clear with this. So we have what I would like to call an applicability paradox. That NIS, I'm talking about NIS here, not NIS2. So NetNod has been under NIS1 oversight, right? So we kind of understand how these oversights take place. And those oversights were done on documentation and administration, not operational capability. Nobody went and looked at our equipment, right? Are we configuring our routers the way we say we are configuring them? Are user laptops set up the way we say we are configuring them? Nobody looked at that. They only looked at the documentation. So it was all about looking at the plan, right? But if you discuss actual operational cybersecurity, how good is a plan when you get punched in the face? Nobody really looked at that. So operational cybersecurity, not necessarily a part of oversight and regulation, as it stands right now in NIS. You could consider this a problem or not consider this a problem. It's just important to understand that it isn't, right? NIS doesn't primarily concern operational cybersecurity. However, operational cybersecurity is very important when shit hits the fan. I don't have a very good solution how to solve this, but I don't think NIS2 is the perfect solution to this problem. So what should you do? One of the big differences between NIS1 and NIS2 is the spectrum of actors covered, right? So in NIS1, you have a quite narrow selection of actors who become important and covered by NIS2. But in NIS2, you have a much, much wider selection of actors. So in NIS1, all of the actors covered, they were probably quite used to doing some form of information security managed work, right? But the thing with NIS2 is that a lot of organizations are now covered by NIS2, which are not used to working structurally with information security. So my recommendation, take a step back and reflect, let the dust settle, then start implementing. Look at things you think will have an effect. Because if you just look at all the articles, especially all the guidelines, you will probably be overwhelmed, right? And also, I want to note this explicitly, that cybersecurity is part of everything today. It's not a separate vertical. And one possible solution I've seen organizations do is they have like this cybersecurity vertical inside the organization. I don't really believe in that. Really think a bit about how you implement your organized security measures. So in NIS2, you should think about the high-level measures and reporting. You need to report incidents. You also need to be able to share certain kinds of information. This is likely to change in different member states where there will be nation-state specific legal implementations of what you need to share under which conditions. And do not forget to allocate resources for operational cybersecurity as well. Don't focus too much on the paperwork. You also need to be able to do that which you describe in the paperwork, or I think so at least. Technically, you could become NIS2 compliant by only focusing on the paperwork. And almost lastly here is that operational cybersecurity is actually quite hard. This is not an easy thing to do. So take your time, make sure you get it right. Plan for operational effect where you can. Don't just do things haphazardly because your member state NIS implementations say you should do thing A or thing B. Think about, will this actually have a measurable effect for us? Because NIS 2 is proportional, right? You can motivate why you do different measures or not do different measures. At NetNod, we'd recommend dependencies. Dependencies are usually a good start. Think about the picture I had before with the two services and their components, right? Start looking at which kind of services, which components are you dependent on for your organization to function. And these could be software components, they could be hardware components, they could be some cloud service you're using, an identity provider, it could be a special competence, etc. So start looking at what kind of resources and dependencies you really need to function. Yeah, and just to draw kind of the high-level schema of what's going on. So in my view, NIS primarily affects processes in an ex-ante way. It describes what should you do to be NIS compliant. We have the Cyber Resilience Act, which goes further down the stack and actually concerns how you do things operationally in an organization. And then you also have the Product Liability Directive upcoming. It's being discussed. There was some informal draft published before New Year's, which I think will have a greater effect actually on how things will turn out, because both NIS and CRA, they are ultimately just overhead. You don't have to change how you do business. You're not heavily liable in a different way. The Product Liability Act can completely alter how you're liable. So the formulation of the PLD will matter a lot, especially for corporations in the digital sector, as it seems like the new iteration of the Product Liability Directive will specifically target digital products, just like the CRA is intended to target products with digital components. Yes, so what's next? Draft laws are now available in some, but absolutely not all European member states. If it's published in your state, do read it, comment if possible, especially on your area of expertise. At least in Sweden, it's important to comment if you do technical stuff, as I would say it is in other countries as well, as the technical understanding in government agencies might not be the best. So do comment, talk to people, explain why certain provisions would work, not work, etc. Ask around about NIS 2. Find out what other things about NIS 2. And then also good to know is that the EU Commission is supposed to review the functioning of the directive in 3 years. So this is 3.5 years from now. It's not completely clear to me how they will do this. So if you have an opinion on this, make sure to voice it to your local regulator as well. If you want to talk, I'm here today and tonight, tomorrow as well. I think that these are the current relevant policy topics, at least in the era where NetNod is active. There might be different regulatory areas affecting you right now. So there's the Cyber Resilience Act going on. The law is not fixed yet. It mainly concerns like CE marking for products with digital components. We have the Product Liability Directive, which concerns how liability is transferred when you build and sell and market a product. And the big thing there with the new Product Liability Directive is the approach to digital products and especially software products. We also have NIS and NIS 2 going on. And if you go specifically to electronic communications, there is right now a EU white paper, How to Master Europe's Digital Infrastructure Needs. which is supposed to set the agenda for the next 10 years of European electronic communications. That's all for me. Thanks for listening. Mm. Mm. Mm.